All right, guys, welcome to week 4 of Apologetics, where we discuss, was Jesus real and did he resurrect? I'm glad you have that answer, Tommy. It's a good start. It's a good start. Now we're going to talk about why.
We know now.
You took all my thunder, Tom. All right. So yeah, there's the big question. Was Jesus real? Did he resurrect? We know the answer. Let's figure out how to show other people that answer. All right, so today's class, we're going to talk about evaluating sources, sources for Jesus' existence once we've established what the good sources are, and then evidence and reasoning for the resurrection. I was talking to Tom earlier about, I was debating whether using evidence or reasoning, because the evidence is hard, but we have secondary evidence for it, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So we're going to look at how historians and other scholars evaluate sources and determine their trustworthiness and usefulness. Again, history major, totally nerding out today. Sorry, guys. We're going to look at extra biblical sources in particular. These are going to be secular and non-secular, religious, non-Christian sources, mainly Jewish. And then they're going to be providing ancient contemporary accounts of Jesus' existence. So contemporary means not just modern day music, right? So contemporary means something that occurred or someone that existed around at the same time as something else. So we're looking at contemporaries of Jesus and those close to that time. And then in the evidence of the resurrection, we're going to look at evidence supporting the resurrection from assessing both the narrative sources that we have in the Gospels and Acts, as well as the epistles. And then we're going to look at events described from people near the resurrection, and then how those impacted how the resurrection account impacted the culture around the early Christians. And so all that kind of building a cumulative case. So first, we're evaluating sources, right? If we're going to be presenting this evidence, if we're going to be presenting these sources, we want to make sure that we understand what makes a good source. So we're going to look at the different types of sources, as well as determining if sources, how we would determine if those sources are reliable. So in the types of sources, and you guys may have heard some of these before, at least in some practice. So we've got primary sources. So primary sources are firsthand accounts, the people that saw the data or the event themselves. These are sources of records or events and evidence that they find first described, or things that they first describe events that actually happened without any interpretation or commentary. It's information that is shown for the first time, or original materials of which other research is based. So in our case, Paul's epistles are a really great example, right? They are firsthand accounts. They're Paul's letters. The research scientists who actually do the experiments and do the papers and stuff on these experiments where they actually witnessed firsthand that data and are describing what they witnessed. That's another good example of a firsthand account. Others would be theses and dissertations, again, where people are doing the firsthand study of things. Research-based scholarly journals, original artwork or poems is another good source. So in summary, they tend to be works that summarize, interpret, reorganize, or otherwise provide an added value. Oh, I'm sorry, that was secondary sources. Never mind. Getting ahead of my notes. I apologize. So primary sources, those are first-hand accounts. People who actually saw things, who witnessed things, who did the experiments, whatever that may be, okay? Secondary sources, so they take information from the primary sources in the simplest fact, okay? So these are sources that offer analysis or a restatement of primary sources. So they'll sit there and kind of, they say, hey, this is what we got. I'm going to explain it a little better to you, or I'm going to get into some of the details that didn't really get into this primary source. They tend to be works which summarize, interpret, reorganize, or otherwise provide added value, like I just said, to primary sources. So examples of these things would be the textbooks, articles that interpret, review, research works, histories or biographies if they weren't written by first-hand accounts, literary criticisms, interpretations, things like that. So, for example, in the Gospels and Acts, so Mark and Luke would both be second-hand accounts, right? So they are, Mark is writing down Peter's story of the gospel, right? And then Luke is writing many people's stories that he's researched and analyzed. So maybe that could be first-hand. But no, he didn't actually witness it, so he'd be second-hand. Same with Acts. Acts is again another historical research. So those are good examples of secondary accounts. The ones that we don't use too often real seriously, but they can provide some extra beef around things, are called tertiary sources. So these are compiled out of secondary sources. So you see we kind of work our way down here. So tertiary sources is a fun word to say. These are sources that index, abstract, organize, compile, or digest other sources, right? So they take all the other sources and kind of put them together. Things like reference materials and textbooks. Some of those may be tertiary sources, depending on what the sources for those books are. So good examples are dictionaries, encyclopedias. Wikipedia is a really good example, because you can go at one thing I love about Wikipedia. So being mid-millennial, being in high school when Wikipedia first came out, in early college when Wikipedia was very early on in its existence, everybody said, Wikipedia is not a good source. It's not a good source. No, but it's a good source for sources. So Wikipedia is great for getting a real basic knowledge of something, but you'll notice Wikipedia tries really, really hard to have quality articles. And so everything in those articles, now they do, yes. Everything in those articles are cited. So you can see those citations. If you're working on some sort of research, and I would do this a lot in my college years, I would scroll down, I would go on the Wikipedia page, get a nice understanding of things from a basic level so I could get a grasp of what I was looking at. And then I would scroll all the way down to the bottom of the article and start mining it for resources, because I was a college kid and I worked 4 jobs at one point while going to college full time. And then I had kids when I finished my college, and it was great. I needed to be efficient. All right. So those are our 3 types of sources. And we're going to look at, actually, I have all 3 of them later on in the lecture today. So I even have at least one tertiary source, which is kind of fun. All right, so next we are going to look at reliable sources, so how we determine reliability. So there's different degrees of reliability that we're going to look at, and then there's also how we justify how we come to those decisions. So in the degrees of reliability, so reliability is on a scale, right? So in history, in particular, that's what we're studying today, is history. So it's rare that we are completely sure that our sources are 100% reliable, because there wasn't adequate enough, objective enough recordings of anything from that time frame. We didn't have video and audio in context. We have accounts. We have first-hand, second-hand, tertiary accounts of events that happened. So we have to kind of determine, as we're looking at these things, where that reliability comes in. So the scale, it's not very complicated. We've got extremely reliable, very reliable, somewhat reliable, rarely reliable, and not very reliable. If there's what some of these spectrums of news sources, right? Have you guys ever seen that pictogram, where on one hand so from left to right, it shows where they fall in the political spectrum, okay, which we all know, we all have our favorites on that side. But from top to bottom is how reliable it's considered to be. So the higher up those guys are, it's not just a pyramid effect. That just happens to be a correlation there. So the higher, the closer to the center most of those sources are, notice how much higher they are than the ones that come out a little farther, the less reliable, the more slanted politically you get, the more you're trying to push that agenda. So you're commentating on the topics that you're trying to write these articles on or present videos or whatever they are. And then the less commentating you are and just fact giving, the closer to the center they are, the higher up they are. It's so weird. But at the same time, just because a source isn't necessarily the most reliable doesn't mean you want to throw it out, because you can use multiple less reliable sources to kind of build up some reliability amongst them if you present your case well and kind of create a cumulative case using those as kind of supplementary support. So it's like, hey, I've got these really great sources, and then I can throw these in there to say, even the people that we're not quite sure about are saying the same things as everybody, as the good ones. So you can kind of add them in as extra oomph to your argument. And justifying reliability. Okay, so how do we determine what things are reliable? So there's several different determinations that we use. So that's going to be one of which is origin. Okay, so origin, we're taking into account who the creator is. Are they somebody that can be trusted? Do they have a particular agenda? Were they eyewitnesses or an academic expert? This type of source is particularly valuable, okay? If we have somebody who's writing letters firsthand, hey, we got a bunch of those, right, for our case. Or somebody who's just very, very objective in the way they present things. So speaking of that, we look at perspective, okay? Perspective, we want to consider what angle these people are coming from. Are they coming from a particular nationality or ethnic heritage that will give them particular insight into this topic? Or do they have a career or study background that allows them to have some sort of authority or insight as well? Context. So context is where the source was created and at an important point of time regarding that event. So is it really close to the event? That's going to help with reliability, because the closer it is, not only are you more likely to be a firsthand account, but there's less time for degradation of the information. Everybody here is of a wonderful age where we remember everything, right? Okay, I'm starting to get to the point where I start to forget what room I walked into. Yeah, it happens. Why am I here again? What was I? Crap. So yeah, as that builds out, I think in my line of work in report writing, when we're writing a report on a particular event that happened, something and we got into some use of force or something at work where we have to describe what's going on. Our policy requires us to write it within 72 hours. They ask us to do one that day, and then we can amend it within the next 3 days as things the adrenaline comes down, we can remember a few things a little better. But they don't want anything past 72 hours, because after that point, things start to degrade a little bit more and more as you're dealing with that stuff. So that's a reliability issue from context. Next is audience, okay? Knowing the intended audience of the source is particularly important. And we'll look at some of these. There's a couple that we're going to look at later where the audience is kind of interesting and it backfires, which is fun. So the intended audience, for example, are we writing to somebody who would have had knowledge of these details? Somebody who saw these things as well, and we've got corroborating evidence? Or are we talking to somebody who has no idea what is going on, and it's just an attempt to kind of sell the story on them? So having that particular, having an audience that is keyed in is also as well, and it kind of gives us a hint as to what a slant might be, a bias within the writing as well. And kind of attached to that is motive. Somewhere there it is. All right. So motive is the specific purpose that the source was recorded for. Okay. So why are they trying to tell me this story? Are they attempting to pass on information? Are they attempting to satirize or ridicule what they're talking about? Are they attempting to just be just objective as possible? Are they trying to sell me on it? Taking those things into consideration so that it helps us filter through that source. and determine what's actually reliable. So now the good stuff. Sources for Jesus' existence. And we're looking primarily outside of the Bible because those are all Jesus, right? Okay. And we're also going to look at non-biblical sources. Some are going to be religious, some are not going to be religious. And we're going to look at some of the scholarly thoughts on Jesus by today's scholars and what they think of Jesus' existence as well. So our first one, and I'm sorry, these next couple slides are going to be really wordy because I'm going to have quotes because everything's written from this time period. So yeah, remember, I'm going to be posting these on the site. If you guys don't have Facebook or anything, let me know. I can email you the things too if you want better ideas. Or it's all on Google. Just write down the names and you'll find that. So our first one that we're looking at, there's extra stuff. So the New Testament's all about Jesus. So we're going to be focusing on contemporary and early commentary on Jesus and Christianity. I think the latest source I have in here is like mid-100s. Okay, so those are going to be secondary and tertiary sources. So our first one is a guy by the name of Thallus. There he is. He hung out in the mid-1st century. So he was probably around when the time Jesus was. All right. So Thallus, like I said, I'm sorry, these are kind of small. Thallus has details regarding the astronomical and seismological events that occurred during the crucifixion. You guys remember what happened during the crucifixion? What does the Bible tell us? It got really dark. What else? Big old earthquake. Yeah. Tore up a whole bunch of stuff. So Thallus tells us that on the whole world there pressed a fearful darkness, and rocks were rent by an earthquake. Many places in Judea and other districts were thrown down. Okay, so this is some good commentary on what happened. And he talks specifically, I'm sorry, I pulled the context out of here, but he does talk specifically about, Passover time and Jesus' crucifixion when this happened. In the greater writing that we have commentary on, and I'll get to that in a second, he's actually trying to disprove the idea that this was some sort of supernatural event by calling it a solar eclipse. But we know that there wasn't actually a solar eclipse that time because we can track all that stuff, at least nothing that naturally happened. We found that out a couple centuries later. We got, who's it, Copernicus? I don't know. Anyway, but yeah, so the astronomers figured out we can track all that stuff now. Now we got apps that do it too. But yeah, there was nothing there. But in all honesty, in my opinion, just the fact that something has a natural explanation doesn't mean that there wasn't some supernatural aspect to it. A good example, when Joshua and all of them came through, across the River Jordan, right, into the Promised Land as they're beginning the conquest of Canaan, what happened? Do you guys remember? The river dried up. Just kind of like, it was kind of like Moses 2.0, right? And I think that was the point too. But the river dried up. They walked through the Jordan River, across dry land, and people were like, oh, well, the Jordan River dries up all the time. There's like mudslides that sure, at that exact moment in history where like all these big things were going on, man, it's like somebody who designed the universe maybe set all that into motion from an eternal perspective and knew when everything was going to happen and maybe set that stuff up. So yeah, it's not really an argument. And I'm getting a couple weeks ahead anyway, but all right. So now one thing though is this is our tertiary source here. So Thallus's writings are actually lost to us. Our account is a quote of a quote. So Thallus was quoted by Julius Africanus, a Christian guy who was doing some stuff. That was kind of like in the 200s, and then the quote that was lost to us. And then in the 800s, 800, we have a Byzantine writer named George Syncellus. He quotes Africanus quoting Thallus. So that's a tertiary source, by the way, in real life. So So yeah, not a huge point, but this is a nice one to kind of keep in your back pocket just to throw in there. And on top of that, right? So that's where that kind of stuff falls in. So here's another first century one. This is Mara bar Serapion. Serpico? No, that's Al Cappuccino. Anyway, okay, so he's in the AD 70s, okay? Anybody, you guys know what AD means, by the way, because we're going to hang out in the ADs the whole time. After death. Shut up, Tom. It's Latin. Yeah, BC is nice and easy. It's English before Christ. AD is Annus Dominus. So Annus is Latin for year. Dominus is Latin for Lord. So year of our Lord, a.k.a. Jesus, 70, thereabout. All right. So Mara was a Syrian man writing to his son. So we have an excerpt of his letter to his son. And he's giving him some fatherly wisdom. So this is considered to be one of the earliest non-Jewish or Christian writings about Jesus, which is kind of cool. So, like I said, it's really long. Mara writes to his son, so what advantage did the Athenians gain by putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as punishment for their crime. What advantage did the men of Samos gain for the burning of Pythagoras? And all of his theorems. Darn triangles. In a moment, their land was covered with sand. What advantage did the Jews gain from executing their wise king? It was just after that their kingdom was abolished. Mind you, he's writing this in the 70s. What happened in 70 AD? Yeah, good times. So God justly avenged these three men. The Athenians died from hunger, the Samians were overwhelmed by the sea, and the Jews, ruined and driven from their land, live in complete dispersion. But Socrates did not die for good. He lived on in the teachings of Plato. Pythagoras did not die for good. He lived on in a statue of Hera. Nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teachings which he had given. So that gives us two things, right? Jesus existed. He was crucified. Three things. He was crucified, and he had really important teachings. And that those teachings lived on further from that. So you see how we're extrapolating data out of these things? So yeah, it sounds like he's telling his son not to be too much of a troublemaker and get it, cause problems. Next, this is a big one. Josephus, the Antiquities of the Jews, AD 93. So Josephus was a Jewish guy who, as his name implies, started hanging out with the Romans. He joined the Romans during the destruction of Jerusalem during that siege in AD 70, after which he became a Roman citizen because he was a nice little trader and gave him a whole bunch of information, and that helped him finish off the Jews. And then later on, he wrote a history and commentary on the Jewish people up to his time. Just a note, so what we're going to look at is his quote is likely edited. Okay, there's a really good chance of that. This is just a little disclaimer. The general consensus on this passage is that there was some editing done to Christianize it. And we have a good guess where those may have been, and I'll show you that in just a second. However, there's evidence that it's not edited quite as much as some would like to think. And in reading the original passage as we know it, as we have it today, you'll see how it's like, maybe he didn't write that. But at the same time, we have quotes from the 200s, okay, quoting Josephus. So this is just 100 years after he wrote this originally, and Christianity's still not real big yet. Remember that. So and it's the exact quote that we still have. So that says something as to its reliability. Furthermore, we've got Jesus talking about John the Baptist, James the Just, who was the brother of Jesus. Unless you ask the Catholics, it was just his cousin. So some people will try to throw out Josephus's passage here that we're going to look at next because it's like, oh, it was edited, it could have been added. But no, he references people in Jesus's life too. So it's all put together. All right, so here's what we have here. So at about this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accepted the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Messiah. And when, upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life. For the prophet of God had foretold these things, and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after him, has still to this day not disappeared. There's a lot of good stuff there, okay? These are the bits that were probably added with the declaration that he was the Messiah, and the declaration of his resurrection. Maybe that could go either way. Also, maybe possibly the if indeed one ought to call him a man. That could go either way. It's hard to say that without having more insight into it, what was really that. But we do get, even when you pull these things out, if you were to completely remove these two lines here, the evidence of Jesus' existence and his early impact on the culture is enough to get a mention in an entirely secularly written history of the Jews, okay? So this is a guy, he's Jewish, he has no interest, he's barely Jewish, to be honest. He's very, very secular Jew. And he's still talking about Jesus and the impact that Jesus' followers had on the culture. We also get in here that he was crucified by Pilate. That's another really big point. So that gives us some time frames too. So even if we pull this stuff out, still some really strong stuff there. All right, next, this is one of my favorites. This is Lucian. He hung out in the mid-100s. So Lucian was a Roman comic. He invented the comedic dialogue. He was the first one to do that we know of. In one of his comedic writings, he began mocking Christians, which is kind of, and it kind of backfired. What's that?
So that's when it started. Oh.
Yeah. Oh, it started before that. This is just one of the first big guys doing it. Yeah. For reference, Nero burned down Rome in the 60s and blamed the Christians on it back then. So, yeah, you know. So it only took 30 years for the yeah. Anyway, we're not going political here, one way or the other, even if I agree with you. All right. Anyway, so what was funny is in mocking the Christians, he actually gives a really good description of their beliefs at the time. He was a good comic. He knew his material. Good comedy always cites real life, right? That's where the best stuff comes from. So yeah, he describes their beliefs really well and kind of gives us an idea of what the early church, this stuff didn't morph gradually into the belief system we knew. So he tells us, these deluded creatures, you see, have persuaded themselves that they are immortal and will live forever. Yeah. Which explains the contempt of death and willingness to self-sacrifice so common among them. It was impressed on them, too, by their lawgiver, that from the moment they are converted, deny the gods of Greece, worship the crucified sage, and live after his laws, they are all brothers. They take his instructions completely on faith, with the result that they despise all worldly goods and hold them in common ownership. So any adroit, I don't know, that's a French word, unscrupulous fellow who knows the world has only to get among these simple souls, and his fortune is quickly made. He plays with them. So basically, it's a whole bunch of gullible guys that'll give you the shirts off their back. All you got to do is ask them for it, right? But again, there's a lot of truth there. Okay, this is again early mid 100s. So we're about a century away from the real big push of Christianity, and we've got things like, what all do we have here? We have so the moment they're converted, they deny the gods of Greece, they worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. They're all brothers. Yeah, we got that. They take his instructions completely on faith. They despise worldly goods. Yeah, I don't really disagree with a lot of what he's saying there. Is that fair? So we're getting a nice impact. So that gives us a really good description of Christians, let's be honest. Hopefully, we're still like that today in a lot of ways.
It's a modified message version of Acts.
Kinda, yeah. That's good. I like that. The message. It's a message version of Acts. I like it. Acts in a paragraph. At least the first half, I guess. Then it focuses on Paul and things change. All right. So the Talmud. You guys know what the Talmud is? It's still actually in use today. All right. So the Talmud, it's a multi-generational collection of rabbinic commentaries. So next to the Tanakh, it's kind of the secondary book in the Jewish religion. All right. So it gives commentaries, notates traditions, and then gives case law in interpreting the Torah. And so it's this, the Sanhedrin said this, this rabbi says this, it's giving these sources and commentary that people are supposed to refer back to. All right, so throughout the Talmud, we have a lot of references to Jesus. All right, so Jesus was a sorcerer with disciples. Okay, from a Jewish perspective, yeah, that's fair. They're doing but what does that also tell us? If he was a sorcerer, he's got some sort of supernatural aspect to him, right? Those are wizards. Sorcerers are different. You should be ashamed just because.
I'm not going to write it, sorry.
It's okay. It's okay.
It's
All right.
tertiary, whatever that word is.
Okay, all right, buddy. Keep trying. All right, so he says that people were said to be healed in the name of Jesus. All right, so not only do we see Jesus doing supernatural acts, he's a sorcerer, right? We see his disciples in his name healing people. Jesus was a Torah teacher, okay? He taught the law. He spoke on Jewish tradition and customs. Jesus was a son or a disciple that turned out badly. Again, from a Jewish perspective, yeah. So we know that he turned away from traditional Jewish teaching, okay? What's that?
He was a Sadducee or a Pharisee, this guy.
No, not necessarily. Those were just two of like 5 sects. Those were the 2 big ones.
The way he's talking.
Well, this is this is a compilation of different people from that time. So the Sadducees and Pharisees in there would have been a part of this. So the Talmud comes from the respected rabbinic folks. So Sadducees were the super liberal Jews of the time. Without getting too far into it, they took a more liberal theology. Pharisees were super conservative. You had, I forget their names, the people with the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were way off on the conservative side to the point where they're isolationists. You have the Zionists were another sect within there. They were the Zealots, as well. So they were the ones that were always like up in arms, and they were kind of conservative, but also liberal in some. Anyway, they were the ones that rioted all the time. And then you just had the secular Jews who just kind of did their best to get along in Greek life, as they called it. So anything that wasn't Jewish, the Gentile, in that world was considered Greek. So they just kind of. So yeah, you've got a whole spectrum there. The Sadducees and the Pharisees were right in the middle. And so this comes actually from the Jewish ruling council, which was called the Sanhedrin. So the Sanhedrin was made up of different rabbis, and they were the judges. Okay, they would sit in council. We saw that during Passover, where Jesus was brought before them. So the Sanhedrin would, people would bring cases to them, religious cases. Secular ones would go to Rome, or whoever the government was at the time. And then the rabbis who made up the Sanhedrin would go into, they were like circuit preachers and circuit judges too. So they would kind of go around their area, and kind of hear cases as need be from a religious standpoint and teach as well. And then they would have students that they would in turn teach, and generations on generations. So Jesus was a frivolous disciple who practiced magic and turned to idolatry. Again, kind of hitting these same points we already saw already. So he was executed. People argue this point at some point. And then he was also the son of Mary. We know that as well. So Did you know that, Mary? We know Mary loves the song. All right, so, and this is just a handful of these sources, okay? Like I said, we only got an hour today, so I can't go in depth in things. You've got a whole bunch of Roman historians. Tacitus is a big one. Pliny the Elder, I think. Might be Pliny the Younger, I can't remember which one. Tertullian, I believe, is another one. There's several notable ones that bring in a lot of stuff here. But I thought these were kind of stronger ones that really were closer to Jesus than any of the Roman sources.
I have a question.
Yes.
With them saying he was the son of Mary, do they give any comment or anything in terms of like earthly fathership versus heavenly?
No, there's nothing there. Now Jesus was considered the son of Joseph. You'll see him referred to as Jesus bar Joseph, which is the Hebrew for Jesus, son of Joseph. So yeah, I mean, as far as most people were concerned, he was the son of Joseph. But yeah, so we've got stuff that says otherwise. Okay, so scholarly thoughts on Jesus. Obviously, Jesus has been studied very in depth over the years, right? So back in the early days of historical Christian analysis or critical analysis of the Bible, which started in, as we know it, the Enlightenment, so 17th, 18th, early 19th century, the Christ myth theory, and that is not Mike Tyson's thoughts on Christmas, by the way. Sorry, that one was for Josh. He's not even here. So after last week's sermon. So this happened. This first popped up in the middle of the Enlightenment, and then sprang up again in the 1970s. And basically, it states that the historical Jesus never existed. He was a mythological character and was later became history in the Gospels. Okay, so the Christian movement completely invented him and made up all the stories about him. There's no way he could have done any of what is said to have done. If anyone who is discussing Christianity with you brings this up as a serious argument, I give you permission to laugh in their face. Seriously, it's not something I normally encourage, but here it applies because it's considered by all serious historical scholars of antiquity, not even just people who study Christianity, okay? Everybody who studies that time period, both religious and secular, that these people are fringe conspiracy theorists. Okay? They so want the Bible to be wrong that they start moving into conspiracy theories. Yeah, right, right. Okay. So we have, I don't know why it came up that way, but that's okay. All right. So Bart Ehrman, anybody know who Bart Ehrman is? So Bart Ehrman is he's a leading Christian, or he's not Christian, he's a leading New Testament scholar. Okay. He's not Christian. He's atheist, agnostic, and he's pretty liberal on things. So most Christian arguments, you're not going to cite Bart Ehrman, okay, from our perspective. This is one where we will, because we're going to say even the most liberal, serious scholars, okay, whatever else you may think about Jesus, he existed, okay? Bart Ehrman even says that, so that tells us a lot. Don't read stuff by Bart Ehrman unless you're super secure in your faith. Okay, yeah, John Dominic Crossan's another one. Reading the Bible again for a second time. I had to read that in a class once. That was fun. Reading the Bible again for the first time. I think that's what it was called. He thought he was clever in his title. So yeah. So long story short, Jesus existed. All the scholars tell us, and now you can tell us why too, right? Moving on, the resurrection. This one's important. Why is it important? We talked obviously from our faith, but from an apologetic standpoint, why is the resurrection important? Week 1.
He's the only one that did it.
Well, he's the only one who did it himself. We'll talk about that in a minute. What is the importance of the resurrection to proving Christianity? What?
We weren't here week one, I don't know.
Oh, you weren't here week one. It's on YouTube.
Sorry.
Paul cites if it wasn't for the resurrection, our faith is meaningless.
Yeah, there we go. Okay. So,
That's what tied everything together. Where they're like,
so
oh my God.
for the benefit of the people who weren't here week one or watched the videos that I sent them, I still love you. You guys were driving through everything with 4 kids in their truck. I'll forgive you. It's what we do around here, right? No. So Christianity is the only faith, religious faith or philosophical thing that actually has a testing point, okay? You can prove Christianity false or true based on whether or not the resurrection happened. Because if it happened, then it proves everything. If it didn't happen, none of the rest of it matters, okay? It is our hinge point. And I've got a handful of slides, so. Lots more on this. You can dive a lot deeper. This is just an intro, remember that. All right. So in the evidence of the resurrection, we're going to talk about what kind of evidence we're going to use, okay? And then we're also going to look into the actual reasons for the belief in the resurrection, okay? In regards to what kind of evidence, this is going to go back to kind of our God story, our God talk in week 2. So God's non-corporeal, right? He doesn't exist in the physical world. In the case of this, you can't produce a body that isn't there. So you can't prove a negative. So we're going to be looking at testimony, the effects on culture, and then additional little details that lend support. So this is kind of going to be on one hand what we looked at when we looked at the existence of God, and on the other hand when we looked at the Old Testament and why we think it's true. So, our reasons for belief in the resurrection. So the first one is we have multiple attestations. We've got a lot of people telling us about the resurrection. All 4 Gospels, okay? And I know some people are like, oh, no, the Gospel, don't use the Bible, that's circular reasoning. Maybe, but the Gospels are actually, as we talked a little bit about last week, and you can look into deeper as well, the Gospels are actually pretty well written history for the time. So even if you have people that say, oh, stuff was edited in, it was, you have this legendary buildup over time. What we do know is that in all 4 Gospels, the crucifixion, death, and resurrection stories, the accounts that are in there, are all one seamless story. They weren't edited and pieced together. So it wasn't, oh, he was crucified and died, and then somebody coming back in later and said, oh, and he resurrected too. It's all one seamless story. So there's no evidence that it was edited in, embellished in any way. It was the writing style matches, it all comes together. All right. Each gospel uses independent sources for their resurrection account. We know that as well. They're not simply just quoting each other and building off. That's, if you studied some of the gospels on the scholarly side from people like Bart Ehrman, they'll say, oh, Mark was written first because it's the shortest, and it probably was written first, but that's beside the point. And then came Matthew, and then came Luke, and then they just kind of built off of each other, quoting each other and embellishing more. So no, we have evidence that they didn't just simply quote each other on these stories. They had different sources. They came in from different perspectives, but they still tell the same story the whole way through, right? They hit on the big points. So we have 6 separate accounts in the New Testament alone, okay, talking about the resurrection. We've got the 4 Gospels. We have Paul talking about it, who, while he wasn't there the first time, he experienced the resurrected Jesus on the road to Damascus, right? And then we have Peter's accounts in Acts, and Peter was part of that. So Peter kind of double dips though, because he's also responsible for the Gospel of Mark. Mark was telling Peter's story. So, and that's actually going to get into our next point. So, in scholastic sources, right, circles. So one good source is great. 2 good sources is pretty much indisputable, okay? Right here, without going too far out, we have 6 contemporary sources that are independent of each other, even if they're still compiled in the same book, right? They're independent of each other. We have reason to believe that, and So why is it in dispute from a historical standpoint? Tom and I were talking beforehand. If you pulled, especially the Gospel of Luke, I love the Gospel of Luke, like I talked about last week, because of how historically written it is. If you were to pull out, do what Thomas Jefferson tried to do, and pulled out all of the supernatural aspects, and it was just the story of Jesus and his teaching, all four Gospels in their own right, especially, like I said, Luke, all four Gospels tell us, and Acts is on top of it as well, tell us a really well-written history from a scholarly standpoint. So why should that change when we put in the rest of the writings within those books? I think that's important to consider. All right. Next, we have early attestations. So we've got multiple attestations. We also have early attestations. So like I mentioned earlier, Mark is considered to be the earliest written gospel, okay, at least of what we have. So Mark's source, regardless, so some people like to say that Mark was written after 70 AD because there's predictions about the destruction of Jerusalem in it. But regardless if you believe that or not, there's evidence for it, fine. And if you believe that or not, Mark's source that he uses, and we know that to be Peter ultimately, but the source material that Mark writes his gospel out of is considered by a lot of scholars to have occurred within the first 7 years after the crucifixion and resurrection. Okay, and there's some reasons that we know this, or at least assume as much. Some of his phrasing, the way he refers to certain people and to certain events, reference phrasing and words that were used early on in the Christian movement and not later on. One example is he talks about the high priest at the time was Caiaphas, right? We know that from some of the other Gospels and other historical records. In Mark's writing, he just calls him the high priest. Okay, he doesn't refer to him by name. So that source says, a good example of that is, okay, if I'm talking about the president, I don't need to talk, I'm having a conversation with you about the president. I don't need to say President Biden, because if I say the president, you know who I'm talking about. However, if I'm talking about stuff that happened 30 years ago, I'm not going to say the president, because the president now is Biden. The president then was Bill Clinton. So I'm going to talk about President Clinton, or President Bush, or President Obama, or President Trump, whatever. Yeah, I'm going to put that context in. So that's the fact that he didn't put that name context in there shows us some indications that it was contemporary to the time. Another really good example is that Mark uses the phrase on the first day of the week when he talks about when the resurrection happened. Later on in Christian, as the culture built up around Christianity, the default phrase was, you guys know what it was? No, on the third day. Yeah, it's okay. You almost had it. I saw you mouth it. Yeah, the phrase is on the third day. On the first day of the week, it's the phrasing that he uses. So that shows us that it was likely before that phrase was codified as something that was the normal phrasing. Kind of like, he is risen. There we go, right? Same concept. Okay. So on the first day of the week, it was Mark's phrasing. The original phrasing is Aramaic. And so when that transfers over to Greek, it's really clunky, doesn't work really well. And so there's evidence within that shows us that it was probably early. Moving on, so we're getting short on time. We've got the enemy attestations, okay? Oh yeah, sorry. Also, Paul in 1 Corinthians, he uses that too, but we'll touch on that a little bit. Enemy attestation. So in the Gospels as well as in the non-biblical writings, some of which we already looked at, Roman and Jewish authorities are making excuses as to why the body of Jesus wasn't in the tomb. However, they had no means beyond that. Okay, so they just insist that it was stolen. So that rhetoric was still being used into the early 100s. Okay, their attempts to explain away the missing body is in itself evidence that the body was missing. Okay, that it wasn't there. The tomb was empty. So that's part of it, okay? We have the embarrassment criterion. So if the story was made up, okay, it was done really, really, really badly. Okay, the way this story happened was not a good way to do it in the first century in that culture. Okay, we've got women witnesses. No offense, ladies, but in Jewish culture, Roman culture overall at that time, it wasn't worth anything for a woman to come tell you something. All right, so Jesus didn't appear to anyone important. What's that? Yeah, George, no, don't start on me with this, man. We're not going down this road, okay? Jesus didn't appear to anybody important at the time. Okay, he didn't appear to the governor or the religious figures or even like Romans or men at first either. You know, people who could testify. In the Mishnah, which is part of the Talmud, it gives a list of people who are not allowed to give testimony. Okay, so we've got gamblers with dice, none of that. We have those who lend with interest. I don't like them either. Pigeon racers. I see you. Yep, pigeon racers. Those who trade in produce from a sabbatical year. Slaves. And all women. So that is the list of people whose testimony don't count for nothing. Women were basically only used if there was nobody else who we could trust around. Good times. And so if you guys are familiar with the Gospel of Peter at all, the Gospel of Peter actually kind of gives us, it's kind of like fan fiction. So it's seriously, it's what it is. If you ever get a chance, actually read the resurrection account in the Gospel of Peter. So the Gospel of Peter actually takes all of these embarrassing parts about the gospel and the account of the resurrection and fixes them. So in the Gospel of Peter, Jesus comes out of the tomb and he's like 20 feet tall and he's enormous and all shining and glorious, and there's angels right around him. And then what follows him? A giant 30-foot tall cross that talks and starts attesting how Jesus is Lord. All right, proclaims his divinity. You know who Jesus appears to then? Not a bunch of women, not a bunch of poor fishermen. He appears to Pilate and he appears to the centurions, important people whose testimonies matter. So, yeah. So the resurrection overshadowed Jesus' teachings. All right. The fact that the resurrection is the basis of Christianity lends itself to the credibility of the resurrection from a logical standpoint. So nearly every religious or philosophical movement focuses on the teachings of its founder, more so than anything else. Jesus' teachings are important, but they are far overshadowed by the idea of his resurrection. Okay, so that, we're working on a cumulative case. We're building all of these things together. Slide 2. 4 more of these. So Jesus demonstrated resurrection power. Okay, of the 9 resurrections in the Bible, 3 are from the Old Testament, 2 are in the book of Acts. Okay, the other 4 are performed by Jesus, and this includes his own. Okay, he's got the centurion's son, the widow's son, Lazarus, that's a big one everybody knows, and himself. Okay, so before his resurrection, we have accounts that we would consider reliable based on not only our readings, but also, like, for example, the Talmud. We saw some of his supernatural aspects in there. That he had the power to resurrect people. So it also implies, given all the other evidence, he could resurrect himself if he could do that, right? So that's important to recognize. Archaeological support. All right, so the account of the crucifixion and the burial in the Gospels matches what we know Jewish custom was at the time. That's important because if they were written so far out afterwards that a lot of critics try to claim, those customs would have changed by then because they're claiming that it happened after the fall of Jerusalem, after all of this stuff fell apart and customs really changed at that point. And what's fun is that all of these details given match beyond what we knew those customs to be up until just recently when we started getting archaeological evidence and such. Kind of like how we talked last week about how Daniel gave us information that we didn't know was true until just recently, even though we already knew it. So kind of the same thing. Some scholars try to push that Jesus was likely left on the cross to rot, that he was never buried, if he was buried, it was in a common grave, or that his body was just kind of tossed off into a heap somewhere left for animals to eat. But we know now that wasn't the custom in Judea. In other parts of the Roman Empire, it was. They really didn't care about corpses. Most of them got burned anyway, cremated. Jews really cared about corpses because of the belief of the general resurrection. Keeping the bodies were important. So at that time, if the Sanhedrin, which we talked about earlier, recommended somebody be put to death, so because they couldn't do it themselves, they had to recommend it to Rome. If they recommended somebody be put to death, they were responsible for providing burial for that person. Okay, that was their job. And while criminals were not given an honorable burial at the time, they were given a proper one because it was super, super, super important. So they were given a proper burial later on. So what would happen in Jewish burial customs, the body would be embalmed, put in a tomb for a year to kind of do what bodies do, and then roughly a year later, usually actually on the anniversary of the death, they would exhume the body and put it in an ossuary, a bone box, and then that's how the body would be kept. We actually have evidence of this. We found ossuaries in that area of people who were crucified. They still have the spikes in their legs. Have you guys seen those pictures? So yeah, that's some of the evidence that we have of that. By the way, do you guys know who was on the Sanhedrin in particular? Nicodemus was one. Do you know who the other one was? Joseph of Arimathea. Who did what? He took care of Jesus' burial. Interesting. All right. There was no reason to invent the resurrection. So Jewish custom of the day did not need the resurrection to occur. The teachings of Jesus to his Jewish followers could still have been honored if he was dead. There was a belief at the time that Jesus was just going to be resurrected anyway, right? The general resurrection. So the resurrection right then and there to Jewish culture didn't matter. It wasn't something that they needed. It wasn't something expected until it happened. It was already built in their system. They didn't need it to develop it further beyond that. If nothing else, the Jews believed in ghosts. Okay, we actually saw that during one of Jesus' early appearances to them. They're like, "Are you real? Are you a ghost? Did you come through the wall?" "No, I came through the door, dummies. I'm right here. He touched me. I'm real, right? I'm not a ghost." They thought that was a thing. So he didn't need to come back in his body. He could have come back as a spirit and continued on with them. And finally, it explains the converts and their actions. So if the resurrection had simply been fabricated to help the disciples deal with the loss of their teacher and their crushed expectations, which a lot of critics claim, like, oh, we have to resurrect him because he was supposed to do all this stuff and it didn't happen, right? You know, we're so invested in him. So if that had been the case, if they invented the resurrection for that, it would have ended with those people who invented the resurrection. Okay. The number of people who converted, people like Paul, in particular, Paul is an excellent example of this. Paul lived the life of a Pharisee. He was ingrained in that lifestyle and those teachings. For him to switch so adamantly and so quickly the way that he did and give up so much of his life the way that he did, there had to have been something that connected to that. It couldn't have just been, I saw a guy die and I felt bad after he got stoned, because that's what some people say. Some other examples. James, the brother of Jesus. What would it take for you to believe that one of your siblings was God? Regardless of what your parent may have thought of them, okay? I was the perfect oldest kid. I get it. I understand. Not perfect, but sure came across that way. The fact that James not only became a believer after Jesus died and, as we believe, resurrected, says a lot, first of all, because up until that point, he didn't believe at all. His family thought he was crazy, as most of us probably would too. So James not only came to believe, he became a big leader in the Jerusalem church, which is where everything was based out of at the time. And he was martyred for his faith in his brother Jesus. Okay, that says a lot. All of the apostles were martyred. We know that. Okay. I'm sorry. All of the apostles except John. John was sentenced to working in the caves, in the mines. Okay, which may have well been a death sentence. So yeah, these people were vested in this. People who were not part of the original, quote, conspiracy, if there were one. So the fact that they lived the way they did, the way they changed their perspectives on the world, what they sacrificed because of their belief in this shows that there is some sort of substance to it, beyond just that belief. These people witnessed and believed something that convinced them beyond any human understanding that it was worth giving their entire lives up, to act against their own best interests and against everything that had been ingrained in them their entire lives, to throw everything away and follow a movement that most of them had firsthand knowledge was either true or was a sham. All right. These people saw Jesus, a man that they witnessed die. They saw him standing before him. They ate with him, they talked with him, and they saw him as he transcended into heaven, and they were changed because of that. I think that's the biggest testimony, more so than anything else that we talked about today. So, all right, we're 5 minutes over. Any questions before we close up? Yes. It kind of fits the fact that there's some non-corporeal existence beyond us.
I think it's even in scripture where Saul goes and sees them.
Yeah, we see a little bit of that. Yeah, although there's some indication that wasn't quite what they expected to see.
Yeah, that's true. Holy crap, it's actually real.
But yeah, no, I think because the Jewish people believed in a world, a non-visible world, the seen and the unseen. We'll talk about that next week. That ghosts just kind of follow along with that. I mean, whether it's human spirits or non-human spirits, I don't think it's unreasonable to believe in ghosts to some degree or another. It's not a very far jump from there, I think. What's actually interesting, the third day is important in that, from that concept. You'll notice, so Jesus flexed when he raised Lazarus from the dead. So Lazarus, he didn't raise Lazarus until the fourth day after he was dead. Do you know why that was a flex? Anybody? Correct. So the Jews believed that after you died, your soul kind of hung around your body for 3 days. And then after that was when it finally departed up into heaven and was carried off. So Jesus was like, dude, this dude's soul not even here. Come on down. So I think that's part of the stuff. Plus, there's cultural aspects to it. You know, it's as you start dealing with, you're surrounded by pagan cultures that believe a lot of this stuff too. So I think we see it in our own culture. So, anything else?
I think it's speculation, but I was talking to Jake earlier, and I was just saying, like, just an example of the political tension we experience today, imagining that Jesus the Messiah did exactly what he said he was going to do. Imagine the political power of Rome and how much they did not want that to exist.
Furthermore,
And maybe what they did to destroy it from existing.
how fast we see the gospel move.
Yeah.
Without social media.
Without any of the communications that we have today, right? And that's a serious thing. Not only did it move so fast, but it stayed the course. You know, talking about 100 years ago, outside of a history buff like me, tell me about some popular teacher from the early 20th century. Seriously, tell me about them.
I mean, you just see, even with Rome, the extreme persecution.
Oh, yeah.
of all Christians, like, they're trying to wipe that religion.
Oh yeah, the Christianity was obscene to Rome. I mean, they really hated everything that Christianity stood for. It was right.
Which, step one, Rome, the resurrection didn't happen. Step two, kill all the Christians.
Pretty much. All right, you're insisting on it? Okay, see you, bye. The Romans actually considered Christians to be pagans, the non-believers, because they they only believed in the one God. That was kind of freaky for them. And so it's, who's the story? Polycarp, I think it was. Away with the atheists. So yeah. All right, guys. If I don't get home soon, my kids aren't going to go to bed. So thank you for a great session. We'll see you next week when we're going to talk about what Christianity is. Now that we've established all the foundational aspects, we're going to get in the nitty gritty, and I'm probably going to tick some of you off because I don't care about your sacred cows.